New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. You know, the most significant work of which I am aware, integrating human consciousness with physics, is probably the collaboration between Carl Jung and the great Swiss psychiatrist and the Nobel laureate physicist Wolfgang Pauli. That took place in the 1940s, 1950s. Today, I am very pleased to have as a guest Timothy Owen Desmond, also known as Tod. He is the author of Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. This is probably the most significant update of the work initiated by Jung and Pauli many decades ago. Timothy, or shall I say Tod, is also an adjunct professor at the College of Southern Maryland in philosophy. He's based in the Washington, D.C. area, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Tod. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks, Jeffrey. It's good to see you.
You've really been digging into areas of philosophy, psychology, and physics that often get ignored or overlooked these days, like the old conversations between Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung trying to figure out where the psyche fits into the physical universe. You've really gone into that very deeply and connected it with, I guess it would be fair to say, the history of science and the history of philosophy.
Yeah, I did. I started that project while earning a PhD at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And it's a philosophy and religion degree with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. So that was leading me to the history of physics and the history of philosophy and how they're converging on this gravitational singularity as the definition of a psyche.
You mentioned the word cosmology, and I suspect it may be a puzzling word to some viewers, especially in the context of a religious studies degree. Cosmology in the religious context is usually very different than cosmology in the scientific context.
Yes, certainly that's a fact. But I would say cosmology in the scientific academic tradition is rooted in cosmology and Plato's dialogues. It was Plato who opened the original academy in the olive grove north of Athens called Academia, and he had his martyred mentor Socrates theorize about the nature of reality, and that includes the whole, the cosmos. And it was Plato who set up the strategy to have an insight into the nature of the psyche and the cosmos through a mathematical study of the stars and of physics in general. So I would say academic cosmology in a scientific mathematical sense and in a philosophical sense started as the same thing in Plato's dialogues, and I'm arguing that they've come full circle back to this reunion of philosophy and cosmology and psychology.
Plato is a very good starting point. He emphasized, as I understand it, what he called the one. And the one could be thought of as the divine. It could be thought of as higher consciousness, or I think the way you are probably thinking is the unus mundus, the unity of everything, both conscious and physical.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. So for Plato, speaking through Socrates, he called the ultimate source and goal of everything the idea of the good. Everything in the material world is a shadowy reflection of some absolute ideal form of that thing, and all of the absolute ideas come from the ultimate idea of the good, which he likened to the sun. It's the archetype of the sun. And then Carl Jung and his partner Wolfgang Pauli, the co-founder of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, they adopted Plato's philosophy, and they call the ideas imprinted on the soul archetypes of the collective unconscious. And they said all of the archetypes come from the unus mundus, which means one world, which they more frequently refer to as the self, or at least Carl Jung referred to it as the self, and the God archetype, and the one. So the idea of the good for Plato and the unus mundus for Jung, the same thing.
Now, both Pauli and Jung were deeply inspired by their own inner experiences. In the case of Jung, he had a near-death experience that colored his whole worldview. And in the case of Pauli, as I understand it, a series of dreams that are reported in the context, I think, of his therapeutic work with Jung and Jung's assistant, Marie-Louise von Franz. And in those dreams, it seemed as if he was being given the answer as to how the physical world and the psychic world interact with each other.
Yeah, Jung analyzed over 1,000 of Pauli's dreams. He referred to him as a young man of excellent scientific education, which was a great understatement. He was considered the greatest theoretical physicist of his day, but Jung didn't want to tarnish his reputation as a rigorous scientist, so he was trying to isolate him. But in those dreams, the thing that Jung focused in on was the mandala symbols. It was Pauli writing down meticulously, like a scientist, each detail of his dream, because he took it seriously. And Jung and Pauli agree that the self archetype, the origin of everything, guides a conflicted ego who's pulled by opposing demands in life toward wholeness through the union of opposites with the psychic images of mandalas, a circle or a sphere with a central point. And in the book, I said, well, if according to Jung and Pauli, the material and the spiritual or psychic worlds reflect each other so that the laws of psychology and the laws of physics mirror each other, and if the ultimate archetype is the self, which produces mandala imagery in the psyche during dreams and fantasies, where is the mirror symmetry in the physical world? And my answer was black holes, which are geometrically perfect mandalas, literally a mathematical point, a singularity surrounded by a perfect two-dimensional sphere. So that was Jung and Pauli's dreams of the mandala leading him that direction. I argue that the mandala image of a black hole led to the union of physics, general relativity, and quantum mechanics, these opposing languages of 20th century physics. The Holy Grail was to somehow unite these incommensurable languages, and that was achieved, at least mathematically, in the mandala of a black hole by Leonard Suskind and his partner Gerard 't Hooft in the 1990s.
Sure, because when Jung and Pauli were dialoguing about these things, the concept of the black hole was at best in an embryonic stage in the world of physics.
Yeah, and Pauli himself, there was a great controversy about the nature of a gravitational singularity. A lot of physicists, they want to get rid of it. Singularities throw the predictive abilities of the equations out the window. So Pauli was included. We need to do something about these singularities that keep popping up, especially when we try to unite quantum mechanics and general relativity. It implies there's a singularity at every point of the underlying quantum vacuum. He said we should do our best to try to eliminate these singularities, but not artificially, not through tricks like renormalization. And he also one time quipped, just because something's infinite doesn't mean it's nothing. When people were saying, ignore the singularity behind the curtain. But it was Einstein's equation, general relativity, in 1915, just a little history. On December 22nd, 1915, Karl Schwarzschild, who was an artillery officer in World War I, he came up with the first exact field equations for Einstein's general theory of relativity that describes the gravitational field. I know that because December 22nd is my mother's birthday. So that was the day that the first exact solution to Einstein's equations were given, and Einstein helped him publish that. Then 2 months later, in 1916, in February, Schwarzschild put out another paper which showed that according to Einstein's theory, if a star of enough mass was in existence, it would collapse into a point of infinite density. And the ratio of density and mass is called the Schwarzschild radius in honor of Karl Schwarzschild, and Einstein rejected that. He did not believe in black holes or gravitational singularities to the day he died. And a lot of physicists even today reject that it's possible for there to be a point of infinite gravity. Like Michio Kaku, for example. He says that's nonsense. There must be a flaw in Einstein's theory. And I'm arguing I don't think there is. I think it's actually reflecting the eternal soul, and all souls are part and parcel of the absolute soul, or the idea of the good, which Plato originally posited as the goal of academic cosmology. I believe, despite themselves, physicists have brought us there, just following the logic of the math.
A point of infinite density, a point to begin with, has no spatial dimensions whatsoever. A point, in effect, exists outside of space. But infinite density suggests, in a way, the singularity out of which the universe emerged at the time of the Big Bang.
Exactly. Yeah, it does. And here's another very important point that a philosopher named Robert Bruce Ware pointed out in a book that he wrote about Hegel. All singularities are a mathematical point, and so they're not in space, so they have no extension in space. And by having infinite density or infinite gravity, that's equivalent to infinite acceleration or speed. And according to special relativity, if you were to accelerate something to the speed of light, time for that object would stop. So would space, because it would contract in the direction of travel into nothing. But it would also be outside of space. Space and time stop at the speed of light, what to speak of infinite speed, which is equivalent to infinite gravity. So a gravitational singularity is outside of space and time, and yet it contains all of space and time. All of them do, because of what this philosopher Robert Bruce Ware pointed out, Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. So Leibniz independently discovered calculus at the same time as Isaac Newton. He's a famous mathematician and theologian. And he said, if you cannot discern a difference between two things, they are identical. And Ware pointed out, all singularities are points. You cannot distinguish one point from another. There's no distinguishing characteristics about it. And they all stand outside of space-time. So you can't differentiate them by their size and structure, nor can you differentiate them by their location in space-time. So therefore, they're all identical. They are different, and simultaneously they're all one, which has spiritual implications, I do say. The supreme singularities, the supreme soul, or the idea of the good, and all of us subsidiary singularities participate, to use the Platonic language, in that ultimate archetype of the psyche or the self or the good.
Well, you're getting to a crucial point from my perspective, because the mystics of every culture have always said we are one with everything. And of course, our daily life experience at the ego level is just the opposite of that. It's we are separate. We are not one. You and I are two different people. We're not the same person. And yet at another level, it would seem as if we are the same. I think people feel that intuitively, that you and I, for example, are different versions of each other at some level. But it's hard to explain that in any physical sense. And you're suggesting here that when we look at the concept of the singularity, the concept of the black hole, and you go even further, if I heard you correctly, to say that every point in space actually is a black hole.
Yes. So
we're united in that sense.
Yeah. It's in the book you mentioned I go through the history of philosophy, and I also include some of the philosophy of the Eastern traditions, the Vedanta philosophy, which is very similar to Plato's philosophy. And in the Vedanta tradition, it started with Shankara. It didn't start with Shankara, but Shankara is a famous Vedanta philosopher from the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. Dates vary, but his point was we're all one. And individuality is an illusion, like a doll made of salt. You return it to the ocean. So the two phrases for that philosophy are Atman and Brahman. Atman is the individual, personal, subjective point of view. Brahman is the all-encompassing potential for all being. So this precognitive bliss that contains all possibilities of individual form. And according to Shankara, this idea of individuality is an illusion which you should merge back into Brahman. But then after him came what are known as the Vaishnava reformers, the Vishnu-worshipping Vedanta philosophers, Madhvacharya, what was Ramanuja first, and then Madhvacharya. Ultimately, Chaitanya, in the 16th century, synthesized, to use a Hegelian term, he synthesized the thesis, if you will, of Shankara saying that we're all one, there's no individuality. And then some of the Vaishnava reformers were saying, no, we are individual units. And then Chaitanya said, Achintya Beda Beda Tattva, inconceivably, simultaneously one and different. We're all one, and yet, in some inconceivable way, we're all unique, separate, eternal, subjective selves. And the way I explain that is that's reflected in the mathematics of gravitational singularities. They all appear at different points of space-time, and yet at the deepest level, which is infinity, because it's an infinitely deep gravitational well, they're all one. And it's impossible, says Chaitanya, to form a conceptual understanding of that's the ground of explanation, which it cannot be explained. And then you mentioned there's singularities everywhere, and that is a result of, at least our discovery of that, is a result of trying to unite general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics. And when you do that, it implies that at this level underlying every point of three-dimensional space is a quantum vacuum, which consists of virtual particle-antiparticle pairs, which emerge out of nothing and then recombine and annihilate each other. And when they do, it creates energy, which a lot of physicists are calling dark energy, which is responsible for the acceleration of the expansion rate of space. But at any rate, the point is the calculations imply that there's an infinite amount of energy at each point of this quantum vacuum, which means it's carpeted with miniature black holes, little singularities. So they're omnipresent. We were all one in the original singularity of the Big Bang, and that original singularity exists at every point of the quantum vacuum, in black holes that exist within galaxies, in the center of every galaxy. And furthermore, these singularities exist at each point of the encompassing sphere of the universe, where from our perspective on Earth, space-time seems to be expanding away from us in every direction at the speed of light. And according to Leonard Suskind, that horizon of the cosmos, from our perspective, is infinitely hot, infinitely energetic. Each point contains all of the information of the past, the present, and the future, holographically conserved at each point of this encompassing sphere, which would imply each point of that encompassing sphere is also a singularity. So singularities are omnipresent. Omnicentric is probably the better word, because from wherever you are, it appears that you are the center of an expanding universe. And so when you combine the fact that singularities are predicted to be everywhere, with the Psyche equals Singularity equation, which came from Carl Jung's Leap Day letter, which we can talk about. The implication is souls are everywhere, and that the cosmos is sentient. It's made of souls or psyches.
Let's talk about Carl Jung's near-death experience now and how that vision colored his psychology and relates to your theoretical work.
Yeah, so I took a class in 2010 on Carl Jung with Professor Sean Kelly, who's a great Jung and Hegel scholar. And I read it, and I thought it was interesting, but it didn't strike me as all that important, because I've read a lot of amazing stories about transcendental experiences. I didn't disbelieve it. I just said, oh, that's interesting. But then when I was watching, just so that we'll understand why we should really appreciate what Carl Jung said, I was watching this TV episode Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman back in 2010, The Riddle of Black Holes. It was the second episode in the first season. And it was Leonard Suskind explaining his holographic string theory, which he had this battle, the black hole war, with Stephen Hawking about, is information swallowed by a black hole permanently or not? And Suskind said, I can't see a flaw with his reasoning, but if that's true, that violates the fundamental principle of information conservation. So therefore, somehow that information must be conserved. He said, oh, here's how it is. If you throw in string theory, it implies that if you follow a bit of information past the event horizon, yes, it's destroyed in the singularity. But if you watch from outside, then the strings of which everything are made are smeared around that event horizon, where space-time is contracting toward the singularity at the speed of light. And then it's released with the outgoing Hawking radiation, which is when these virtual particle-antiparticle pairs emerge from the vacuum on the razor's edge of the event horizon. The antiparticle gets pulled back in, the virtual particle gets released, and it carries a bit of information from the event horizon back out. So information is conserved from that perspective. The universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity rather than contracting into one. So the cosmic horizon, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light, all of the information of the interior volume of the universe is conserved at each point there. Past, present, and future are all smeared out and contained at each point of this encompassing sphere, and then it radiates back in with the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMB radiation, on these elastic threads of energy to create the cinematic hologram, to use Suskind's word, of our three-dimensional reality unfolding through time. So when I heard him explaining that, I was recalling Carl Jung's near-death experience, where he said he had a heart attack. He broke his foot in 1944. He had a heart attack in the hospital. And then he felt his body, his psyche, leave his body. He's looking down at the hospital. He's rising above the earth. He sees himself 1,000 miles above the earth. He noticed the reddish sands of Arabia and the clouds. And he found himself just above Ceylon, south of India. And then he looked and he saw a boulder the size of his house, hollowed out into a temple, like the ones he had seen in the Gulf of Bengal when he visited India. There was a black Hindu in a white robe sitting in the antechamber. I guess that's the entrance room. And in the back, there was a brilliantly lit room. And he felt as if all of the people to whom he belonged in reality were back in that room. And as he approached the temple, he said he felt his entire biography get ripped from him. An extremely painful process, he said. And then it was all given back to him simultaneously. So he lived his whole life simultaneously. And he was about to enter into that room, and the primal form of his doctor, Dr. H, rose up above the earth and said, the earth has need of you. I forget the exact quote, but the world needs you. You need to come back. And then he was back. And when he got back into his body, he dreaded every morning, because he said that it seemed to him, he had visions for 3 weeks after, and when he combined his visions that he would have every night for an hour after midnight with the original near-death experience, it was just one continuous series of events. He said it seems to him as if the past, the present, and the future are interwoven out at the horizon of the cosmos, where life is experienced blissfully. He experienced all of these archetypes the marriage of Hera and Zeus, this garden of pomegranates, all of the archetypes in the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe are located at this horizon of the cosmos, his own words, and that each of us here in the three-dimensional world is imprisoned in a little box of illusion, tethered to the horizon by a thread. So that was the exact mirror symmetry with Suskind's theory. He repeated it 3 times. He said it seemed as if we're each in a little box, imprisoned in a 3-dimensional box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, and that the past, the present, and the future are conserved blissfully out at the horizon of the cosmos. So that was the 4th of July, 2010, and then I realized, here's going to be my dissertation, I hope, because I needed to come up with a dissertation topic. And I'd already read about Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's attempt to find the mirror symmetry between the laws of physics and the laws of psychology in order to infer the underlying archetypes or the absolute ideas. If mind and matter both emerge from the same absolute source, which are these archetypal forms, then there should be some parallel between them. And here I saw a perfect parallel, really, between parapsychology or psi and, let's say, paraphysics, holographic string theory. Just this perfect point-for-point parallel. And then everything just started to fall into place. The mandala theory, the whole universe is an inside-out black hole mandala. At any rate, that was his near-death experience. And it also led me to infer that the collective unconscious that Carl Jung famously describes is the horizon of the cosmos. And that our conscious egos are here in what appears to us to be the center of an expanding universe.
Well, I think it's a brilliant synthesis. It certainly sheds a lot of light on the nature of the psyche itself and how the psyche might be related to the cosmos, which is an important insight. And yet, I keep wondering why, of all things, Leonard, Suskind, and holographic string theory, when you consider all of the different competing cosmological theories right now. Suskind's is just one of several. And in fact, science is always evolving. And so it seems as if, 100 years from now, this holographic string theory, it might become recognized as fundamental the way we thought of Isaac Newton's theories for centuries. On the other hand, so many scientific theories fall by the wayside.
Oh, certainly. And studying the history of physics leading to holographic string theory made me well aware of that. I said, what makes me think that this isn't just another phase to be outgrown in the future? And what makes me think that is that it has brought us full circle back to the origin of academic physics in Plato and in the Vedanta philosophy. So it's more a matter of faith that I say, here's this perennial philosophy of Plato and the Vedanta. Is it just accidental? Is it just coincidental that this rigorous history of struggling to come out with the perfect mathematical forms to describe nature, culminating with describing black holes, has just accidentally come full circle back to Plato and the Vedanta? I don't think it's an accident. I think it came there despite the best intentions of people like Suskind, who's an atheist. That gives me all the more reason to say it was the truth that pulled him there. And it's not just one more phase. It is the alpha and omega, the beginning and the end. But that's kind of a point of a religious leap of faith on my point, but I think I've got good reasons for thinking that he really did. Suskind and 't Hooft, Nobel Prize winning physicist. I believe that they've really zeroed in on, I'm sure it will develop more and it'll be fine-tuned and tweaked, but I think that's the basic story. In Hindu philosophy, Vedanta philosophy, the outermost sphere of the universe is called Akasha. And that's translated as ether oftentimes, but the past, the present, and the future exist in this outermost sphere. And in the center is Garbhodakashai Vishnu. Mahavishnu exhales all of the bubble universes in the multiverse from each pore of his skin, and then he reclines in the center of every bubble, and then he reclines in the center of every atom, as Kshirodakashai Vishnu or Paramatma. Plato doesn't have the multiverse, but the Vedanta philosophy does, which is another big part of string theory. It predicts a multiverse of universes, which makes me see the parallel with Vedanta philosophy in that respect is even more intense, which makes me again believe holographic string theory is not just another truck stop on the highway toward truth. It's brought us back to where Plato predicted it would.
I think your theory is very exciting and stimulating, even if it's incorrect. But it does seem to me that we live in an era where Platonic philosophy and Jungian psychology and string theory are all on the fringes of our culture. None of those ideas are culturally mainstream in the present era. It seems to me.
Yeah, and I think that we need to overcome that problem and bring it back to mainstream, because the mainstream society is misguided extremely. It's got a compass that's not pointed to true north, and the assumption in academia, at least among the leaders, it seems to me, is a mechanistic, materialistic cosmology, which we know is not true. I know Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist anthropologist, a Darwinian evolution biologist, I forget his exact specialty, but he's most famous for advocating against belief in God and soul. When he pondered the implications of quantum physics, how it just undermines the entire mechanistic cosmology, his excuse to ignore it was that it's queerer than we can suppose. It's so strange that it's too strange to think about. Let's just ignore it and go back to Isaac Newton's theory that we're all the little bits of irreducible bits of insentient matter existing in three rigid dimensions of space that endures through this linear timeline that goes forward at the same rate regardless of, that's Newton. And that's the mechanistic worldview that most people see themselves within. And that was undermined by every step forward in physics in the 20th century. Special relativity says the past, the present, and future coexist. General relativity said, yeah, not only that, but gravity is the curvature of the fabric of space-time, and it gives you singularities, which are basically synonymous with the soul when you define one. And then we had quantum physics with the particle wave paradox. There is no little bits of insentient matter. They act like particles when you observe them, but when you're not observing them, they behave like waves of mathematical probability, which are not material things. And then you get to holographic string theory, which we've been going over. None of that supports the claim that we are these little robots like Descartes thought our bodies were. René Descartes, the famous Cartesian split, said there's unthinking matter extended in space, and there's thinking substance that's not extended in space. Then that's a soul. And only humans have a soul in God, because the symptom of a soul is reason. Animals don't have reason. Therefore, they're just wind-up machines. It might seem like they're conscious, but they're really not. That led to this horrible environmental catastrophe. But the Cartesian definition of a soul does apply to a singularity. It's a substance that's not extended in space, and therefore, by Descartes' definition, it's a thinking substance. But the point is to think that we live in this mechanical world made of material bits is clearly incorrect, because there are no little bits of matter. That's been disproven. Maybe holographic string theory hasn't been proven, but the fundamental truth of Newtonian cosmology has been proven to be an excellent approximation that's very useful as a rough guide. But when you factor in things that are extremely small or extremely massive, it's useless. And so we know its picture of reality is just a kind of a sketch, and it doesn't tell us the fundamental reality. And yet most academics cling to this incorrect physics to describe the human being.
Well, it's interesting that you draw upon the work of Leonard Suskind, who's a professor now emeritus at Stanford University in the physics department, certainly an esteemed professor, not a Nobel laureate nonetheless. But as you point out, he was person who totally bought into the materialistic, mechanistic worldview, and he was well aware of the fact that his theory seemed to point in a different direction. And I know he went to great lengths to say that even though it seems to be the case based on my work and the work of others, that the universe was created by intelligent design, he said, I have to refute that. It may look that way, but it can't be true.
Right. Yeah. And I question how strong his mechanistic atheistic faith is, honestly. I think he's not as much of a materialistic atheist as he presents himself in his books. Because in private interviews, well, not private, but YouTube interviews I've seen with him, he's like, oh, I'm an agnostic. I don't know what's going on. And in one of his books, he wrote about this cosmologists and fishicists, using a metaphor of fish living in an ocean, how they would describe it. But one of the fish said to another one, oh, that sounds mystical. He's like, yeah, but let's not say that or we'll lose our funding. If you start talking about, oh, yeah, my theory's pointing to this spiritual worldview, they cut your funding, was what he was trying to say. But regarding his point about, oh, the universe might look like it's intelligently designed, but it's not, that came down to what's called the cosmological constant, which describes the expansion rate of space-time. And the thing is that all of the parameters, the physical parameters that are required for biological life to exist in the universe, have to be extremely fine-tuned. And the cosmological constant, which describes the expansion rate, Einstein initially inserted it into his general theory of relativity in 1917 to counterbalance the gravity of everything for everything else, the attractive force. It should be causing the universe to contract. Einstein wanted there to be a static universe, so he inserted this repulsive anti-gravity, which he called the cosmological constant, which he then retracted in 1929 when Edwin Hubble discovered the universe is expanding. Einstein said that was the greatest blunder of my life. Well, the cosmological constant was rediscovered when it was 1999, and using the Hubble Space Telescope, they discovered the expansion rate of the universe is accelerating. It's not slowing down over time. What's causing this? And I mentioned the dark energy before, the creation and destruction of virtual particle-antiparticle pairs. Well, to get to the number of what the cosmological constant is, it's got to be so small, but it's not nothing. And it was a decimal point with 116 zeros and a 1. And if it was even slightly different, then life couldn't have evolved. And not only that, the speed of light has to be just what it is, and all of these other structural constants of physics have to be perfectly fine-tuned, each of them exactly as it is, or there wouldn't be life. So if this is the only universe, Suskind says, then it's inescapable. It's intelligently designed. It's obviously fine-tuned for life. But the way he gets out of it is, he says, yes, but string theory implies there's a multiverse of universes. And they don't like infinity, so he says, well, even if it's not infinite, it's just so enormous, the number, that it becomes inevitable that some of them, some minute percentage of them, will have all of these lucky hits just perfectly aligned for life. And that's his way out of acknowledging intelligent design, which is fine with me, because I say, okay, well, for my purposes, here's what you've given me. You've given me the holographic information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos, which agrees with Plato and Carl Jung's near-death experience in the Vedanta. You've given me the singularity in the center, which I'm equating with this soul. And you've given me a multiverse, which the Hindu philosophy says is the case. So you've supported me in my worldview in so many things that I'll grant you. I believe there is a multiverse, but I think that they're probably all fine-tuned for life, because I think the singularity is God. And it's not that God is in there with a socket wrench making everything just right. It's just a natural flow from God's own infinite intelligence. It's an effortless manifestation of the supreme soul. But that is, he acknowledges, this universe sure does seem to be fine-tuned, but it's not, because there's a multiverse.
Well, I'm very intrigued by your equation, and you mentioned it several times, and I think it's worth going over again. The soul and the singularity, meaning, in effect, the soul is the same as a black hole. It's a little puzzling to me. I mean, I get the logic of it, but I think it's worth repeating for the benefit of our viewers. But on the other hand, I'm inclined to think that all black holes and everything physical exists within the mind at large, rather than equating mind at large or source or God or consciousness with something inside the universe, like we account for black holes. They may not occupy any extension in space, but they can be located in space. We can pinpoint where they are, like at the center of a galaxy, for example.
Right. Yeah. And that is... So coming back to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, there are black holes in the center of every galaxy, or almost every galaxy. Then there's medium-sized black holes strewn throughout each galaxy. Then down at the quantum vacuum, at the Big Bang. But they're all, and that's how you can account for differences of subjective experience, but then they're all one. So you mentioned how the black holes are within the universe, but I'm also equating the universe itself with a black hole. Suskind calls it an inside-out black hole. It was Stephen Hawking who originally looked at it that way, because he took Roger Penrose's equations for a black hole and he reversed the time dimension to create a model of the Big Bang. That was his dissertation in 1965. Robert Sciama was his graduate his chair of the dissertation committee, and for Roger Penrose, if I recall correctly. But at any rate, the entire horizon of the cosmos is I'm calling the collective unconscious. And then the central singularity is the conscious side of the self archetype, and together they create one. But the equation that really helps me to isolate the psyche as the singularity was Carl Jung's, what I call the leap day equation. February 29, 1952. He was writing a letter to J.R. Smithies, and he was trying to account for why we cannot measure the mass of a psyche. Because, and Jung learned from Einstein himself about relativity theory. I believe it was 1909 to 1913, occasionally they would meet in Switzerland. So Jung learned about relativity theory from Einstein before general relativity, but while Einstein was working on general relativity. And he knew about E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Units of energy can be translated to the units of mass if you multiply the units of mass times the speed of light squared. So if psyche has energy, which Carl Jung believed, it must have some measurable mass. Why can't we measure the mass of a psyche? And in one letter, he said, maybe it's because it's too small. But in the Leap Day letter, he said, maybe the reason we can't measure the psyche is because it's infinitely heavy. And then he said, if you were to accelerate something to the speed of light, it would disappear from space and time. And he started speculating about intensity versus extension in space. He mentioned infinite intensity and minute extension. And then he concluded the letter with this sentence: psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity is infinite intensity, which he mentioned previously in the letter. The smallest space is zero. So if you put infinite intensity of energy or infinite density in a point of zero volume, that's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So that equation can be translated without any error as psyche equals singularity. And then everything really does start to fall in place when you interpret Jung's definition of the psyche, and everywhere you plug in the word gravitational singularity, then all the mirror symmetries between psychology and physics that Jung and Pauli were looking for, and Plato, become much easier to see. And this mandala model of the self is a big one. If the mandala is an image of the supreme self, well, what is this universal self? And I'm saying it's the universe itself, which is the inside-out black hole perfect mandala of our universe. So you were mentioning black holes maybe are within the mind of God, but to equate a black hole with the mind of God, that seems like somehow narrowing things down too much for the infinite being. But the nature of this horizon of the cosmos is infinite. It's infinitely energetic at each point. And it's also a subjective location where it appears is dependent on where you are. Although when you have a near-death experience, many people oftentimes recall going out literally to the horizon of the cosmos, which they call the point of no return. If you go beyond it, you can't get back into your body. But I see what your point is. It seems like identifying the God archetype with some object of the field of physics, it just seems limiting. But that's the nature of black holes. They stand outside of space-time. That's why physicists, especially the atheists among them, really feel uncomfortable with the whole idea of a gravitational singularity. Because that's not physics anymore. The laws of physics break down. It's not in space-time anymore. And I'm saying, yeah, that's because it's the psyche. That's where the laws of psychology take over.
It certainly seems as if, as you paraphrase Leonard Suskind's holographic string theory, it seems very metaphysical. We're talking about things that are way beyond the possibility of being observed scientifically.
Yeah, he mentions that. A singularity can never be observed by the fact that it's sucking all light into itself at an infinite rate. It will never radiate any energy by which you could detect it directly, although you can infer its existence by its gravitational effect, which you can see, and we have. We've photographed the gravitational effect immediately surrounding black holes, and we've located the orbits of stars in our own Milky Way galaxy. They're clearly orbiting like planets around some incredibly dense object. But the strings of string theory are so small, down at the Planck scale, Maxwell Planck, or Planck, I was corrected by my professor, Sean Kelly, said it's Planck, 10 to the negative 33 centimeters, I believe. At any rate, it's so small, and Suskind explained it. To see down to something that small, you need wavelengths of light that are incredibly intense. To create wavelengths of light that intense, you would need an accelerator, like an atomic accelerator, where they collide atoms to split them apart. You would need one of those the size of the galaxy and a trillion barrels of oil a second to fuel it. And then you could see it. So it's not that it's outside the realm of empirical observability, but it's way outside the realm of what we are technologically capable of observing. And then the universe is outside the horizon of the cosmos. They are outside of our ability to perceive because light is expanding. Space-time is expanding at the speed of light past there. The singularity itself, that's outside of space and time, and physics breaks down. So yeah, holographic string theory definitely starts to seem like mystical philosophy, which I think explains part of the reason Suskind adopts this more of an aggressive atheistic approach to insulate the theory and assure other physicists, this is not mysticism. I am an atheist. I reject all that mumbo jumbo. This is just strict mathematics. So this is where the math has forced us to go to save the principle of information conservation.
Yes, Suskind seemed to feel that this principle of information conservation, which was at the heart of his debate with Stephen Hawking, is even more fundamental than the conservation of mass and energy or the laws of thermodynamics.
Yeah, it was the first time I'd ever heard of it, the principle of information conservation. But he says, yeah, it is. It's more fundamental than those other principles that you cannot create or destroy mass or energy. I thought that was the most fundamental principle. And he explained, no, it's, for example, if you explode a hand grenade, not only must every fragment of the metal and all the gases maintain their existence in the universe, but you should theoretically be able to trace each of those atoms back to the grenade, because the information that describes how it was exploding through space-time is still conserved in the universe somewhere. If you had a computer strong enough, you could reconstruct it. But if it goes into a black hole, then Hawking pointed out there's no way that information is gone. The energy is compensated. Energy that goes into a black hole is compensated by Hawking radiation coming out. So this is starting to get really technical. The quantum vacuum we talked about, virtual particle-antiparticle pairs are constantly erupting out of nothing and then recombining and exploding. And that creates this energy, which always makes me question, how can you neither create nor destroy energy, yet it's constantly being created at the quantum vacuum? And they say because it happens so quickly, it still allows that law to hold up. My mind gets very numb when I start to think about all of these things. But Hawking said at the event horizon, the antiparticle and the virtual particle, if they emerge right at the event horizon, the antiparticle gets sucked in, and it's always the antiparticle that gets sucked in, and the virtual particle goes out. So energy goes into a black hole and it's erased, but then it's compensated by the outgoing Hawking radiation, and it maintains this balance. So the energy's maintained, but the information of the energy that went in, says Hawking, is lost. Or at least Suskind, hearing Hawking talk, realized, well, what you say implies the information is lost. And the theories of quantum physics are more especially dependent on the conservation of information, the nature of the wave of probability. It surpasses my ability to really grasp it clearly. But the point is, how do you conserve the information that goes into the black hole? The energy is conserved, it's compensated by Hawking radiation. But that information, how is it conserved? And he said, I was losing my mind. I was having a nervous breakdown. These are all the symptoms of being torn by opposing demands that Carl Jung and Pauli said will be compensated by your psyche, by the collective unconscious, with mandala imagery. And it will show you the path toward wholeness through the union of opposites. And the way Suskind describes it in The Black Hole War, his book, My Battle with Stephen Hawking to Make the World Safe for Quantum Mechanics, he says, I was really freaking out. And then ultimately, he came to the solution that, yes, Hawking's correct. Information is lost from the perspective of someone following it past the event horizon. Once you go past the event horizon, you can't get back out, and it's annihilated in the central singularity. However, from the perspective of someone outside the black hole, they would see the information, and that he defines as twists and turns of a fundamental string of which everything is made, would get smeared out around that event horizon. And then the outgoing Hawking radiation would carry each bit of information like a letter carrier, like a mailman. And that's how that information gets released back into the universe. And the opposite happens in reverse at the horizon of the cosmos. And Stephen Hawking, at any rate, conceded defeat in this point. He says, yes, you are correct. And I believe it was 2004 when he officially said, yeah, that I agree with this theory. It's defeated my theory that information is destroyed in a black hole.
To paraphrase what you just said, the information going into the black hole, you use the phrase passing through the event horizon. I believe that's also known as the Schwarzschild radius of the black hole, is it not? And you've also equated it with the Akashic field of the Vedanta.
The inside-out black hole of the universe, the cosmic horizon, would equate with the Akashic field. Because the past, the present, and the future. So here's another important point. So what I just talked about, from one perspective, information falls in a black hole and it's destroyed. From the perspective of someone outside, it's conserved and it's released. It's conserved on the event horizon, smeared out, and then released with the Hawking radiation. So that's called black hole complementarity. Mutually exclusive perspectives of the same thing. The reverse happens at the cosmic horizon. If you follow information past the point of the speed of light expansion, you can't get back in. Information is lost from the universe. But from someone inside the universe watching from the appropriate distance, through a telescope, you'd see all that information smeared out around the inside of the spherical border and radiate back in on strings of energy with the cosmic microwave background radiation. So that's called cosmic complementarity. And then the third principle is called the holographic principle, which is a general principle that applies everywhere, including a black hole, and that is that the information that describes any three-dimensional volume of space is actually recorded on the two-dimensional surface area. So I'm in a room here. All of the information of the room, this computer, the chair, the desk, is located at every point of the ceiling, the floor, and the walls. And it's radiating in from there on these strings to create this holographic movie. But Suskind says if you go out and try to observe the information at the two-dimensional surface area, it recedes to the next concentric boundary, which would be the atmosphere of Earth. And if you go there, it recedes to the heliosphere of the solar system, and then to the galactic halo of our galaxy. And ultimately, all of the information of the universe is located at the horizon of the cosmos. That's the holographic principle. And that I correlate with the Akasha. The Akasha is just one element of these concentric spheres of elements: earth, water, fire, air, ether, or Akasha. Some models add 3 more subtle elements: mind, intelligence, and false ego. However you define the terms, the outermost sphere is going to be the one where the information is conserved, according to the holographic principle.
If I was to try and create a mandala representing each person, we'd have to think in terms of the perimeter of the mandala, typically a circular perimeter, and then at the very center, the singularity, a point of infinite density. And in effect, at the deepest level, I think what you're saying is that's who we are. That's our psyche. We extend to the very boundaries of the universe itself and to the very center, to the very heart of it, where everything is infinitely dense.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think the term mind-blowing in this instance or mind expanding is literal. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And that I identify with this body on my day-to-day life. Philosophically, I don't. I'm like, oh, this is a holographic illusion, and I'm really radiating in from the central singularity in the horizon of the cosmos. But as I walk down the street and deal with random people, I'm not really putting it in that context all the time. But I believe that this three-dimensional volume of space is like a dream. I know the Vedanta philosophy says it's literally Vishnu's dream, that we're living in Vishnu's dream, the Supreme Self's dream. And our material bodies are dream projections of our true selves. And our true selves are at the horizon of the cosmos and the central point of the universe, which those terms turn into each other depending on where you're located. But I'm definitely saying that each of us is part and parcel of the omnicentric gravitational singularity, and that God, the self archetype, sees through each of our subjective points of view simultaneously. So I went to Boston College. It's a Jesuit school, and I remember one Jesuit priest, at any rate, it was a class on Plato, and he said, it's important to know God is you, but you are not God. There's nothing about you that isn't a part of God. God is entirely you, but you are not God. And the way I interpret that is God is me. God sees and experiences everything I experience, but God also sees and endures everything you're experiencing and everyone else down to the quantum level simultaneously. And by doing so, God thereby has a unique ego of God's own, whereas each of us just is more or less, under normal circumstances, only aware of our own subjective point of view. I think we have access to the omnicentric mind of God for brief periods, like the mystics. And that's how I differentiate between the singularity that is the subsidiary self, you and I and everyone else, and the supreme self. The Supreme Self is simultaneously aware of everything that all of the individual selves are experiencing.
Tod Desmond, this has been a very elegant and a beautiful picture of the cosmos. If you're correct, we're talking about what could be considered the outlines of a final theory.
Yeah, I remember earlier you said it's an interesting theory, even if it's wrong. I've thought that myself sometimes. I'm like, you know what? Even if they prove me this is wrong, and I have to admit, it's a fascinating error. And that's why I don't think it is, because I don't think I have the ability to create an error so elegant and beautiful, like you mentioned. That's what gives me more faith that it's just true. I'm just seeing the parallels between psychology and physics fall into place, like Jung and Pauli predicted.
Tod, thank you so much for being with me today and for sharing your magnificent vision with the New Thinking Aloud audience. It's truly been a joy.
Thanks, Jeffrey. It's been great. I was really looking forward to this conversation. It did not disappoint.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we are here. I imagine that by now, many of you already realize that in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the New Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death? New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.